All right, so for the history of prostitution, we're looking at chapter 4. If you've got the yellow edition, it's on page 192, but this document's in all editions of Through Women's Eyes. It's just the primary source pages at the end of chapter 4. And the history of prostitution document, what we're interested in, there's two things here I want to show you. So the first thing is what Singer's trying to do is trying to figure out, he wants to end prostitution, so he thinks the way he could do this is by talking to prostitutes to see like what caused the situation for them. So he interviews about 2,000 of them. And before I show you the document, I did want to point this out to you too. On the first page, he gives us kind of like an image of who these women were, and he tells us here on page 191 that these women are young. They're 15 to 20 years of age, that most of them were born in the United States, but among those that are immigrants, more than half of them are from Ireland. A fifth of them were married, which tells us again they did not make good choices. Half of them had children. And this also speaks to how tenuous this job was. Half of them have been domestic servants. Half of them also have syphilis. So it tells you here the average length of life after entering prostitution is 4 years, because you can get that sexually transmitted disease. So a pretty grim image there. To kind of get things started. And then the 2 points I wanted to point out to you in this document. The first is on page 193. It's in the right-hand column. And it just tells us like how desperate it is to be a woman in the 19th century. He writes here, the details give some insight into the undercurrent of city life. The most prominent fact is that a large number of females, both operatives and domestics, so he's writing there about operatives, that's the Lowell Mill girls, and domestics, he's speaking about domestic servants. So he says the most prominent fact is that a large number of females, both operatives and domestics, earn so small wages that a temporary cessation of their business, or being a short time out of a situation, is sufficient to reduce them to absolute distress. And then he continues, he says, even if they try to save money, they have nothing to save. So the very day they encounter reverse, it sees them penniless. And so I think the way he writes there that to be in absolute distress is something to think about, what it meant to be a woman in the 19th century without a successful spouse. He says here too, the struggle a virtuous girl will wage against fate in such circumstances may be conceived. It is a literal battle for life. Again, another kind of grim picture of what it is to be a woman who doesn't have access to that cult of domesticity. So that was the first reason we wanted to look at Singer studies. It just shows us like how really none of these are options. What a woman needs to do is she needs to get married, and she needs to find a spouse that can financially support her. But the second reason, that'd be two, not one, the second reason we want to look at the Singer study is it sets up female sexuality in the 19th century. Essentially that women aren't sexual beings. And this is on page 192. He says here on the right-hand column, the force of desire can neither be denied nor disputed, but still, in the bosoms of most females, that force exists in a slumbering state, until roused by some outside influences. In the male sex, nature has provided a more susceptible organization than in females, apparently with the beneficent design of repressing those evils which must result from mutual appetite equally felt by both. In other words, man is the aggressive animal so far as the sexual desire is involved. So again, in language that we use today, he's basically saying that women are not sexual beings. He says here that in the bosoms of most females, that force exists in a slumbering state. So women aren't sexual beings, and the only way they are sexual beings is if some outside state arouses that. And again, according to Sanger, this could only be a man. So again, a very heteronormative, no sexuality for women, and then a very heteronormative understanding of how that sexuality functions, which is significant for the next topic we're talking about, the possibility of, even though women wouldn't have had this word to describe themselves, right? They wouldn't have had the word to describe themselves as a lesbian, but we will clearly, from our perspective, identify their relationships in this way. Saying your Slinus, though, that there's really no concept of that possibility, although we know it existed in the 19th century. Okay, if you've got questions, you can put them in the discussion board below. Thanks.